Hey Digital Landscape Architect, welcome back to the Giants Editor Basics series. In this video we will get your hands dirty. We will build mountains and dig some holes while exploring the different terrain editing modes and build a small landscape. At the end you will have created this. We will look at how to change the terrain height, paint textures on the terrain, create foliage like grass, flowers or bushes, infolayer paint, and get an idea what procedural painting does. In this video I will assume that you already know the absolute basics of the Giants Editor, how to open a map file and how to move around. If you don't, you should watch this video first and then come back here. Let's jump to my computer immediately and get going. Here we are at my computer now. I am in front of the vehicle dealer at the moment. The vehicle dealer has a free space in front of it where the new vehicles spawn. That's a good area to try out the terrain editing. If you're not there on your map yet, you can go there by opening the gameplay folder and then click on Vehicle Shop and press F. Then it will immediately take you to that cube which is highlighted for me here. And then you can use this space in front of the dealer. Any other free open space is also fine if you are in a different place on the map. What do I mean when I say terrain editing? Terrain editing is everything which makes changes to the terrain. That can be changing the heat of the terrain, painting textures on the ground, adding foliage to the ground and bushes. But it can also mean adding field details such as tillage, and something which is not even visible for you would be editing the infolayers. Next level of this would be automating all of this by using procedural placement. You can open the terrain editing modes by going to the toolbar and changing terrain sculpt or terrain detail texture paint, mesh paint mode, infolayer paint mode, or procedural placement, or foliage paint mode. We will start with the terrain sculpt mode. If you click that, your cursor changes to be a brush, and it will also open automatically a new window, which is for all the terrain editing. It has different tabs depending on which mode you are in. We see here I activated heat now. We also have texture, mesh, foliage, info and procedural placement. And there you have different options. We will go through that in a minute. If that window is not in the same place for you, don't worry, you can just grab it with a mouse and move it wherever you like it. First, we will now have a look at the terrain sculpt mode. In the menu, you find different settings for the brush. The first setting is the size. You can change that by using that slider over here. You can also change it by scrolling with the mouse, or you can also enter a fixed value over here. Then we have a setting for the hardness. The hardness defines how hard the edges are. This is the very soft edge. You can also see this with the white circle and the red circle. The red circle is the outer edge of the brush and the white is the circle where the effect is 100%. This one is very soft, but the bigger you make the setting, the edge gets harder and harder. So 1 is a completely hard edge. I usually go for values around 0.5. Then you can change the brush type, round and square. That's obvious. And then for each mouse button you have an opacity setting. We will go through the different mouse button settings in a minute, but the opacity is basically how strong the effect of the selected painting mode is. There's also a preset over here. That's basically for saving your settings, but I don't find it very useful because it's only for the opacity and the hardness. The rest doesn't get saved, so I don't use it. Let's now go through the different modes. You find here settings for LMB, that's left mouse button, MMB, that's the middle mouse button, and RMB is the right mouse button. And if you open that drop-down field, you see the different editing modes. And for each mouse button, you can define a different mode. For example, by default, the left mouse button is on Add, the right mouse button is on Subtract, and the middle mouse button is on Smooth. And then also for each mouse button, you can define the opacity, so how strong the effect is. So let's now go through the different modes. If I do Add and hold the left mouse button, I can change the terrain and create some mountains. Subtract, right mouse button does the opposite. I will create holes. If I go over the terrain which I just added, I will flatten it again. But you can also do it via Smooth. That's the middle mouse button, and that will smooth out the edges of what you did. If you do it long enough, you will end up with a flat surface again. Let's now change the left mouse button to Replace. With that setting, you can copy a heat from one place of the terrain to another. You need that setting here under Sculpting. The Replace heat is now set to 49. But if I want to change it or copy it from an existing point on the terrain, I can use the Ctrl-R shortcut. You can see that here. So if I want to flatten it out again, like put it on the same heat as this place over here, I go there with the mouse, press Ctrl-R, and then I can replace it again and make the whole thing flat again, like this. In order to show you the erosion, I need to first make some mountains again. Let me do it that way. And then if you choose erosion, you will immediately see what the effect is. So it's basically mimicking the natural erosion which you might see on mountains. The last mode we need to cover is the slope mode, and the set slope target and slope belongs together. Let me first create a small mountain over here. And now I want the terrain to gradually rise until this point. Then I first use the set slope target and I click where I want the slope to end. And then I change to slope. And then if I start drawing, you can see that line and it will gradually adjust the slope to my target point. So this is how you can easily make driveways or something like that. That's very helpful. So let me flatten that out again. I go Replace, and then I make it flat again. That was basically everything about the heat mode, the sculpt mode. Let's move on to the texture paint mode. That's the next button. The tab here will automatically change to texture as soon as I click the button on the toolbar. The texture paint mode is for painting on the terrain. The brush settings which you see over here are roughly the same, but some options don't do a lot. You will see that in a minute. And we also don't have the opacity per mouse button, but we only have one opacity. The most important thing here is the texture layer. You can select that under texture. And here we have asphalt selected, but there is of course a lot more options. You can see that's a very long list. So let's now paint some grass. I select grass over here and I will make my brush a bit bigger. And now with the left mouse button you can paint the grass. Although the middle mouse button and the right mouse button do have some modes defined over here, they don't do anything. So basically what you want to do, if you want to get rid of the grass and have the other texture again, you can use the Control R, what we already used for the heat, because that will enable you and take the texture from what is below the brush. Control R will set it to Asphalt Dark, and when I paint Asphalt Dark now, the grass is gone. That way you can easily switch between different textures which you already have. There is also a very interesting feature. This is the Enable Limit 2. If you check this box, you can limit the painting you are doing to a certain texture or also to a certain foliage. So let's say I only want to replace the Asphalt Dark by grass. Then I limit my painting to the Asphalt Dark texture. And when I now paint grass, you see that I'm not painting the whole terrain. That is because Giants is mixing up different textures on this terrain. If I move over that light gray one and press Ctrl R, you can see that this one is asphalt and not Asphalt Dark. So if I change this one, limit to asphalt, put that one back to grass, then I would be able to also paint over this one. There's also something interesting about how the names of the texture layers are written. You can see that some of them are in caps and some of them are made of small characters. And that is because the ones in capitals are combined layers and the others are single layers. So what does that mean? I will show you. For example, we have grass 01. I will paint something with grass 01. Oh, I should get rid of the Enable Limit. So this is the grass 01 texture. And now I will use grass 02. This is the grass 02 texture. And what the combined layer does is basically mix up these two single layer textures into a combined one. That is the grass in capital letters. If I paint this, you can kind of see that it is a mixture between the other two. The disadvantage of having these single layer textures is often that you get a lot of tiling, as you can see. Our eye is very good at registering any repetitions or patterns in the texture, so that's immediately visible in this one. And also in this one, you see a lot of repetition. And the combined texture layers, because they mix up these textures automatically, it already looks a bit less tiled, but you can still see a bit of tiling when you look at it. But also if we get a bit further and we put some foliage on these textures, it will not be that visible anymore. If you want to know how the combined textures work or which single textures are in it, you can right-click on the terrain and open the Layer Manager. Here you can see all the base layers. These are the single textures and all the settings files behind it. And if you go to the Combined Layers tab, you can see which of the single layer ones are in the combined textures. So if I scroll down to grass, you can see here that it mentions grass 01, grass 02 is part of the combined layer grass. This is also the same menu where you would define a new layer if you want to create a new texture for your map. So is there anything we can do about this tiling? As I mentioned already, it will be definitely less visible if we have foliage on the grass, but not every texture will have foliage on it. So if, for example, if you are talking about the asphalt, you will not put any foliage on the asphalt, so there it doesn't make sense. For grass or dirt, of course, foliage might make sense. So what you can also do is mix in different related textures. So if we have a look at the list over here, we also have, for example, grass dirt or grass moss or grass patchy. These are all similar textures, and then we can mix them in by just painting a bit, making the brush smaller, and then that looks already a lot less tiled. Let me add another one, maybe grass dry. If you do it kind of random, that definitely gets rid of that tiling effect. But then you should also make your brush really small so that you don't have these very big patches. Going down that route, it's easy to spend hours and hours painting on the terrain. I did that when I worked on my map. I will show you some images now of what I was working on, and basically I spent hours doing that kind of thing. But with the new version of the Giants editor, it will definitely be more helpful if you use the procedural placement instead. That's a bit more complicated, and that will be a topic for another video, but it's definitely worth learning it and spending your time on it if you find this really important to not have this tiling in your textures. Let's now cover the foliage paint mode. That's the button with the plant, and it will also change to the foliage tab in the texture window. This allows you to paint plants. Let me make my brush a bit smaller. And then in the foliage layer, we can define what we want to paint. Let's start with deco foliage. And then the layer state is the different subcategories. For example, I can paint small dense mix. Let me get a bit closer. And this will basically create patches of like small different varieties of plants. You can also paint bushes that you find under either Deco Bush or Deco Bush US. That's different bushes. And here you have now a different menu. So let's try the blueberry small bushes. They look like this. And then you just paint with your brush. In the deco foliage you also have like flowers, for example. And if you want to paint grass, there are two options. You have meadow and you have grass. The difference between the two is basically the meadow is normally used for like the roadsides or meadows around the map, while grass is more meant to be on a field. The meadow grass is a bit more yellowish and the field grass is quite green. Let me show you the difference. This is the meadow. This is what you would see on a grass field. Also in the foliage painting we have the same limit to possibilities what we had in the texture paint mode. We can limit the foliage to a certain texture. So if I only want to paint on the grass dirt, for example, I can limit my textures to the grass dirt. And then let me choose meadow again. And if I now, apparently I did not have grass dirt, but I did use grass patch. Yeah, so yeah, now you can see I'm only painting on the grass patchy. Let's add some more bushes, maybe a bigger one. Deactivate the limit 2. Yeah, and that looks already quite interesting. Looking at the textures again, you definitely do not notice any tiling anymore because of the foliage. as I mentioned earlier. And also what you can do with the foliage painting is the Control R, what we used for the heat and the textures already. So if I press Control R now, it will automatically select what I have under my cursor. So here you can see it's a prairie, blazing star, wild bergamot, green middle grass, or a small dense mixed foliage. Also in this mode you can paint crops. So I can choose wheat over here, harvest ready, and then paint this just as you would have it on a field in game. That is under the crops. And you can also paint terrain detail. And here you find different ground types, for example plowed. If I paint this, it looks like the field status of a field which has just been plowed. With the right mouse button you can remove what you just painted, but only if you are on the correct foliage layer. So let me select this one again. It's not doing that automatically, so first I have to switch back to, for example, meadow. And now Control R should work. Yeah. And now with the right mouse button I can remove some of the grass or the flowers. But that does not work in every menu, so you might have to set the foliage layer manually. And then for some of the related layers it will work, and for some it will not. And the reason for that is that in the background the information is stored in different files. So if it's not taking what you want when you press Control R, then choose the foliage layer manually. So as a bonus, let's now add a tree. We can do that by going to File, Import. We choose Import as reference. You should always do it as long as you are not planning to make changes to an object, and we're not making any changes to a tree. So we choose Import as a reference. And the trees you will find in the game folder under Data, Maps, and then Trees. And there each type of tree has a folder, and within the folder you would find the different stages of the trees. So let's choose an oak, and we choose oak stage 3 maybe. And then you can see here in the scene graph that it has been loaded, but I can't see it because it has been spawned at the origin. So I select it and I press Ctrl B and then click where I want it. And now we have a tree. That looks already like a landscape which you might see in game. The next thing we want to look at is the infolayer paint mode. You can find it behind this blue eye in the toolbar. Infolayers is a specific type of information where you can store additional info for the game. For example, about your environment, or about farmlands, or if you're indoor, about navigation, tipping, placement, or field types. We will go through them in a minute. Basically, this is information painted on the land which the game can use. You have similar brush settings like for the other paint modes. You have the size, opacity, hardness. You can switch between round and square brush, and then you can have different settings for the different mouse buttons. But as we also saw in the other painting layers already, not all modes do something. Basically, you only can use add and subtract in this mode. So let me set add to left mouse button and subtract to right mouse button, which is also the default. The first info layer which is displayed is the environment info layer. If you have a look below that, under area type, you have different settings. Can be open land, city, village, harbor, industrial, or open water. The different settings over here can make the sounds, for example, in game different. And so if you are open land, you might hear birds or whatever, while if you choose industrial, you might not hear any birds. And also I think if you are under open land, you also have the setting water, and you can choose between water, no water, or near water. And I think what near water is doing is basically steering the fog effects in game. So that might be useful if you want to have some fog near your water on your map. The best way to understand what the info layers are doing is, again, having a look what is already there in the existing map. That will help you get a better idea of what Giants did with these info layers. So let's zoom out a bit. For that you have to deactivate the painting mode. So I go to the info layer paint mode again. All the white areas over here are the selected areas. So this is currently defined as being open land and no water. If I change it to near water, obviously the areas near the water will get white. You can also use Ctrl R in this mode. So if you are above an area and you don't know what the setting for it is, but you want to know, you hover over it, press Ctrl R, and now it switches to open land, no water, and this is what this setting is for. This area here near the dealer is obviously defined as being industrial and no water. We have some other layers. You can see them here with the different colors. Over here is a pink one and here is a blue one. Let's Ctrl R on that. So this blue part is basically industrial and near water. I believe that's the paper mill. And the pink one here is harbor and near water. Next to the environment info layer, we also have the farmlands. The map gets quite colorful when you switch to that, because every farmland has its own color. If you open the land drop down, you can see all the buyable farmlands on the map. We have 100 plus not buyable. And also here, if you Ctrl R over the land, this is, for example, farmland 10. This is a non-buyable area, and so on. The indoor mask is basically where it doesn't rain or snow, or where at least snow doesn't stay on the ground. Currently we have the outdoor selected. If I switch that to indoor, these are all the areas where we won't have snow. Giants wants the streets not to have any snow, and also like the area at the dealer, for example. Navigation collision is something for the AI. Can we see something here? As far as I can see, everything is selected over here. And then tip collision. The blocked areas for the tip collision means these are the areas where you cannot dump any bulk material on the ground. You can see here that's the streets, obviously. But you also have tip collision generated info layer. And this is the tip collision info layer plus some additional info which has been generated in-game or in the Giants editor using procedural placement, which we will talk about later. Same we have for placement collision and placement collision generated. Placement collision is where you cannot place any buildings or something in-game, and the placement collision generated looks much more full, as you can see. And here you basically have all the areas which are blocked but in-game, so you cannot build on them. And this is also a generated thing using procedural placement, and you can see here that basically around every tree you have a blocked area where you cannot build. A lot of people get annoyed by this, playing the standard maps, because yeah, you have a lot of areas which are blocked. If you want to change that, you can do that, changing this info layer. And lastly, the field type either has default or rise. That more or less explains itself. If you want to paint a rise field, you have to set it on rise and then paint. But obviously here in the US map we do not have any rise fields, so we cannot see anything over here. Generally, painting on the info layers is just what we did earlier. The add mode in the left mouse button here adds something to the info layer, and the subtract mode, for me under the right mouse button, removes the info layer. Oftentimes you hear that you should not undo stuff which you did on the info layers. It's better than to use the subtract instead if you did something wrong, because if you try to undo things, that might crash the Giants editor, so be aware of that, and save often if you're working with info layers. Last thing I want to cover is a bonus which makes painting a bit easier. It's using shift. So I'm still on the rise field painting, but that doesn't matter. It also works with the other painting modes like foliage or terrain. The shift button is important for that. If you click and hold the mouse button and then press shift, you can make a straight line. You can see that over here. And when I release the mouse button, it will paint this line. That's the first shift mode, but that will only work in 90 degrees, so either that way or that way. Another thing you can do is, after you clicked, then release the mouse button and then press shift. That will create a line to where your mouse cursor is, and when you then click once, the Giants editor will draw a straight line. That's very helpful if you want to build straight areas, roads or whatever, then this is really useful. Let me get rid of that. I'm using the right mouse button now to remove what I painted here, because we don't want a rise field here. And then lastly we have the procedural paint mode. Procedural paint is basically an automatic paint mode. It is basically a mixture between terrain painting, foliage painting and info layers, because what you do is when you paint on these info layers, you create an information for the game or for the Giants editor where to place what. And you have certain scripts which then will get executed on this area to place textures or foliage or whatever. For example, I selected here the PG forest, and that's an info layer which Giants was using, obviously, to mark forest areas. And then you have a separate menu for procedural painting where you can define rules which the editor will then execute and fill in the area based on these settings with textures, foliage and also trees or other objects. So that makes painting and filling the terrain much easier than doing it manually. But also, this is such a big topic that I will make a separate video for that, only for the procedural placement, because that is already a lot. That's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. You can now already do a lot of stuff. I hope you feel ready to use this in your own projects now. As mentioned, we will do procedural placement in another video. That's already quite advanced, but it will save you so much time and it will give you a huge advantage over all the modders who paint their terrain, foliage and plant their trees manually. So, see you next time.